We have spoken about the four horsemen. You've heard about the four horsemen. You understand what the four horsemen can do. We know that they are behaviors. They are not ways of being. They can lead to prolonged states of behavior that can then have an outrageously prolonged effect of costs, a prolonged cost. And what we're going to do today, this is the first video of a 6-video series about healing, lesser restoration. I don't know if lesser restoration is a correct word. That's a gaming term, but about healing, basically healing, and counteracting some of these things. And to first do a lot of the steps in healing or counteracting maladaptive behaviors is to understand that it's going to take, just to start, it requires you to have a minutia of accountability. That's the toughest part. It's the first step, a minutia of responsibility and or accountability, or both. And once you can do that, once you can start to take inventory, take accountability for what's happening in your life and why it's happening, then we can start the journey of healing. But until then, you can't, if you're not aware of what's going on, you cannot transmutate anything. You can't change something if you're not aware of it. If you don't know, if you remain not knowing what you don't know, it keeps happening. And so I think a great example of this is when people get into cyclical relationships. You may find somebody getting into a relationship with a different human, but the same behavior. And at some point, you have to just call a spade and say, you're the common denominator here. Or look at yourself and say, I'm the common denominator in all these situations. What am I doing? And it's not blame, judgment, or anything. It's what is the action that's being taken that's getting the same result? And then, how can we change that action? Going backwards, be, do, have. Who do we have to be to take on a different action to then have a different outcome? And the different outcome just happens happens. I mean, it is just an effect of you being like a different person or approaching it differently. So really, healing starts with taking accountability with what's going on. I know that's tough. And it's not even to say that you're responsible for what's happening right now, but it's the question of who are you being? What is the environment that you've kept around you? What are the things in your life right now that you can possibly change? What have you been aware of that you're like, I don't know if that's really serving me. Actually, that might be the reason, me hanging around with that everything is going in a loop. What is causing the loop? I mean, these are all questions, not declarations or, blame or judgment. I just want to, again, be very clear about that. Asking yourself the questions about accountability and responsibility. Who am I being when that happens? Who am I being when I say that? Who am I being when I respond that way? And again, these are all just, we're touching the surface here. We're just skimming the surface here. But the four horsemen, we talked about this earlier, so we're going to dive a little deeper. And the four horsemen, which we drew up, and they have an order for it. I thought the order was totally different. But criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Now, I definitely used to ride shotgun with the third and fourth horseman, probably more the fourth than the third, because I thought that it was a means of self-preservation. And self-preservation is more so, in my opinion, it's a healthy boundary. So you're drawing a healthy boundary. You're saying, hey, this is not okay. For me to be my best self, I need to draw a boundary here. This is something we do in interventions all the time. When you use that language, I will not be around. Or when you are using that substance, I will not be around. When you are not using that substance, then I can hang out. When you are not using that language, then we can hang out. And that was always really important because you're never seeking to control anybody. You can't control nobody, but you can control where you put yourself when things are happening and certain behaviors are afoot. And I think that's really important to take note of just in the regards, or at least the realm of intervention. And so with the four horsemen, there are some by the book methods to counteract, and then there's just like my general opinion of how to get after it. So for the first one, criticism. In criticism, it's if you understand what criticism is, it's pretty blunt. It's very, I really want to, actually I should start with this. Marked and unmarked terms. A lot of us speak in unmarked terms. How fast did you run the race? How well did you do in that test? How tall are you? Marked terms are, how slow did you run the race? How dumb are you? How short are you? And we don't really speak in marked terms because it puts a limit, it puts a cap on everything. Unmarked is to say, there's no limit to it. Like, it's almost like an optimism. Oh, there goes that train. There's a positivity to it. And so we are then able to kind of just see something and say, well, how good is it? I mean, like, because, it can only be like, not how bad is it? So the idea with criticism is that it is a very marked way of communicating by saying, why did you do that? Why wouldn't you have done it this other way? And it's just like, it's blunt on its face. To counteract that is, and we talk about this a lot in therapy, and it's softening the language. Whereas by the book it says a gentle startup. And I have marked terms versus unmarked terms down here. And this is where we dispel meritocratic language. So instead of how bad or could you have done this differently, it's a question of, so how did that make you feel? Like, what would you have done differently if you did it differently? Is there any chance that you could see yourself doing this differently down the road? There are different ways to phrase things. I remember there was a woman on TikTok who had an entire encyclopedia of corporate language, like how to approach people and say certain things a certain way. So it comes off as unmarked. And one of them was, she was on a talk show and one woman was like, how do I say stay in your lane? And she was like, I'm really busy at the moment doing what my obligations are requiring me to do. And what you're asking me to do right now is going to take me away from some of my responsibilities. So I would kindly request that you basically talk to somebody else that this may fit their requirements of their day. She said it way better than I just said it, but it was just like, it was like, whoa, you can actually phrase it that way. And I think it's important to figure out a way to communicate with your partner or with other people in a way that can give space to the answer. And I go back to when I held up the guitar player when I was on tour. He had flubbed up on stage, and I pulled him aside right after, or I think it was even on stage. I was like, hey, you messed that up. Then after the show, he stepped to me and he said, hey, there's nobody on stage that knows that I messed up more than me. I need you to approach me off stage. Don't do it in that way again. And I said, okay. And there's other people that talk about this all the time, certain athletes, that they would have coaches ream them out in public, and that athlete would have to then step to that coach and say, don't ever do that again. Like, I need you to talk to me in private. Because when you leverage the public against me or the rest of the team against me, it's making it way worse for everybody. And I'm not going to be a part of that. And I thought that was beautiful because it's healthy communication is what it is at the end of the day. It's requesting a higher standard of communication, which I know that we all can do that. There is no problem with requesting a higher standard of communication. So to counteract criticism, you can show up in a softer tone and in a less harsh way to better communicate the thing you're already trying to get after. So there's that. I think we'll have more examples for that down the line, but that's what I got for you for right now. But contempt, the next horsemen. What I have by the book here, it's a lack of building a culture of support. That's what it has in the book. And contempt is like the next level of criticism, where it's like IDGAF to the next level. And when it gets there, contempt is slamming the door, cementing the hinges shut, and either you have to climb over it or deal with it, and that's it. I'm not going to do anything about it. The respect is gone, and when we can start establishing healthy means of communication or requests for healthy means of communication, having healthy communication is the thing that combats contempt. You're creating an infrastructure and a frame that addresses poor management off the bat, that addresses condemning language and marked terms off the bat. We will not have that here. We will speak with respect, and that's the only way we're going to get through this thing, or the only way we're going to manage this team, or the only way that this relationship is going to function. I know a married couple, they have a rule where they don't even joke about divorce. They just don't. They don't even entertain it, even as a joke. And for them, I see that as so important because I'm like, oh, wow, they set the tone. Regardless of what you think, what the tone or the rule is, they set the rule and the tone. And I think that's so beautiful because it combats contempt, because contempt can't even get within a football field of that situation if nobody is allowed to even joke about it. Because we take this so seriously, we value this so much. The counter action to contempt is to value. When you value a situation outside of yourself, then you wouldn't even think to bring contempt in it in the first place. It just wouldn't happen. Like, I can't think of being in a partnership where that would be something that's a means to a healthy end. That just wouldn't make any sense. Like a romantic partnership. Like, families do this all the time. I mean, because biologically you don't really get another family, and some people may cut ties with their family and say, hey, I'm going left. You know, y'all can just deal with it. However, it puts it in a tougher spot because sometimes, you know, what do you do when you're with family? And I think setting the tone or talking to family members saying, hey, I don't think I'm going to be around the dinner table if that happens again. Okay. And that's, I understand everybody has to deal with it, but I can't be the best family member I can be if you're speaking to me like that in front of everybody. Which I most definitely had to do once or twice. But it's creating a culture of accountability. And I think that that's really beautiful. And how do you create a culture of accountability? How do you create a culture of support to combat contempt? That's up to you. The third horseman, defensiveness. This is the simplest counteraction in the whole book. This is not the easiest, but I'm saying the simplest. The counteraction to defensiveness is taking responsibility. And this may be the toughest because some people may have never taken responsibility in certain fields. You have certain folks that have been told yes almost their whole life. And the second that they do something wild and out of pocket, and somebody says, hey, you just did something wild and out of pocket, they lose their mind because like, how dare you call me out on this? And the idea with really taking responsibility is it means you go inner. It doesn't mean public evisceration or you get, you know, tarred and feathered or scolded in front of everybody. If you can deal with it privately, like if you can deal with it internally, there's nobody outside of you that's ever going to hurt you. You can't. When you have the confidence to take responsibility and accountability for what you did, then there's no win or lose. It's just you upgrading yourself. It's not a zero-sum game at that point. And I'll tell you this, the first step that I took towards personal accountability, it wasn't making amends with people that I felt I had wronged. It wasn't acknowledging that at all. It started internally with me saying, boy, we really were on some BS. The second that I was able to do that, I was able to then mark any time where I was on BS and I was just totally inauthentic. And so what I will do sometimes is I will just reflect and say, nobody knows my BS more than I do. Because nobody does. I know exactly when it's happening. I know exactly when the sarcasm is not just for fun around like good friends, it's being weaponized to like, you know, hold off some vulnerability. I know exactly when it's happening. And the question is, do I identify with it or not? Do I mark it or not? I don't, you know, that's the next step, right? I think once you can start to identify your own BS, then that's the road towards responsibility. It's a very low bar, but but once you get going, it can get better, but you got to take that first step first. And the last of the four horsemen is stonewalling. And the way to healing stonewalling is this one's, oh man, This one is pretty emotional for me because we get tools from people that either raised us or were in our environment, and we saw that those tools maybe worked for them at the moment, and we took those tools up, and we were like, we're gonna use those too. And I've really seen stonewalling, people go to the grave with it. It's not something that should be taken lightly. It's not something that ever really measures lightly to my understanding and experience in life. And I know that the counteraction to stonewalling is to deal with yourself first. Stonewalling, to me, my interpretation of it is saying that if I eradicate my communication or socialization with this person, then I'll be fine and I'll show them, which is it's gamifying life. And we'll get to this in some later videos, when you game everything, you lose yourself. And once you start gaming friendships, relationships, all this stuff, you then create a scoreboard, you create who owes you what, you create an emotional leaderboard and all this stuff. And it doesn't lead to any authentic joy or building or growth that you can have with other people. And when that keeps going, you keep accruing the debt. You create emotional currency that you then build out credit lines and all this stuff, and you start cutting people off, and you're creating a system that nobody's aware of, mind you. And you're the only one that's gaming it. You're saying, well, I'm gonna stonewall this person if they don't, emotionally react the way I want them to. It's manipulative, it's a lot of things. But the way that you counteract it is that you deal with, why am I having this reaction? Can I create a healthy boundary here? Stonewalling is when you either have no access to or no knowledge of how to create a healthy boundary. Yeah, it's when you just start blowing up bridges and cementing door hinges shut, building walls that have no business being there, and drying out rivers and canyons. It's a means to isolation is really what it is. And when you isolate yourself, you are then the one that has to deal with how you got isolated in the first place. The walls that you built, the walls go both ways. The ravines go both ways. The bomb bridges go both ways. When you stonewall, you are the one that has created the barrier. So then later on, if you're to ever want to reconnect or want to take this thing down, you have to take it down. Because you built it, and if the person respects it, it is what it is. But if you build a healthy boundary and just communicate as we go back to criticism and say, hey, I'm requesting that this happen without this language or without these marked terms, and I can operate in this space. But when you're speaking to me like that, or when you're withholding from me like that, or when you are or taking action in that way, I don't feel like I can be around that. Or there's the other way of it, where I have some trauma-informed things going on, and I need to kind of sit down with that before I enter into this relationship. If you have a broken ankle, you can't go onto the court. You can't do it. You got to heal up. Stonewalling can also be a means of not healing before you get into a situation. So the counteraction to that is to then heal, but do it in an authentic way that you know you can return to the situation. So those are some counter actions you can take, or means of healing, to then not take on any of the 4 horsemen. And we'll go back over it real quick. Just 3 quick takeaways. For criticism, you can speak softer or approach things in a softer tone. I think that's actually a little bit marked, but with criticism, you can approach things in a more open form of question, as opposed to bluntly hitting somebody over the head with the question. For contempt, you can build a culture of support and a culture of accountability. Essentially just saying, we're gonna support each other here, and that type of language, we're not gonna allow it here. Defensiveness, take responsibility. And for stonewalling, it is either a lack of healthy boundaries or no knowledge of them, or a lack of self-awareness and doing the internal work, or no knowledge of it. You have to deal with yourself before to combat stonewalling. Otherwise, you're going to think that blocking people out is going to make you better, which an effect can't create an effect, as we said in an earlier video. That is it for now. Those are the means to combating the 4 horsemen. If you have any other means of that, put them in the comments below. Looking forward to seeing how other people have combated this or had forms of healing about this. But this is the first of 6 videos on healing. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one.